An immediate ceasefire and Russian withdrawal. Kyiv has made its demands known ahead of talks with Moscow in Belarus. Fighting still rages across the country on day 5 of the invasion. Ukraine says Russian troops appear to have slowed the pace of their offensive. We have correspondents in Kyiv, Moscow and in Brussels. But first, a look at the latest developments on the ground.
After hours of quiet, gunfire resumed across Kyiv and Kharkiv. Residents in the capital woke up to the sound of repeated sirens. The city of Chernihiv in the northeast endured heavy shelling overnight. Residential buildings, a market, and a kindergarten have been targeted. In the face of the assault, the Ukrainian president says he plans to release prisoners to help defend the country.
Українці з реальним бойовим досвідом будуть звільнені з-під варти і зможуть компенсувати свою провину у найгарячіших точках війни. Ще з деяких людей, учасників АТО, знімаються всі санкції. Ключове зараз – оборона. 5-та доба повномасштабної війни Росії проти народу України. Стоїмо міцно. Ми пережили за цей час стільки, скільки іншим народам може не випасти і за десятки років.
Despite Russian troops advancing closer to the capital, a curfew in the city has been lifted. Hundreds of thousands who spent days in darkness underground have been able to venture out for food and supplies before heading back to safety. Russia's military now claims it will allow civilians to leave the capital safely.
Все находящиеся в городе мирные жители могут беспрепятственно покинуть столицу Украины по трассе Киев-Васильков. Данное направление открыто и безопасно.
Ukraine's military has been ready to point out how Russia suffered heavy casualties in the last couple of days, and that its army managed to repel Moscow's repeated attempts to capture major cities.
Російські окупанти знизили темпи наступу, але все ще продовжують спроби розвинути успіх на окремих напрямках в наступальній операції проти України.
There are growing fears of a further escalation in violence after Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered his nuclear forces on high alert.
Putting his nuclear forces on high alert basically sends a message to the United States and to NATO. Do not intervene in Ukraine under any circumstances. It could be that the Russians are planning on using brute force, these thermobaric weapons that we've seen against civilian areas, simply to blast the Ukrainians to the surrender table.
And Stuart Smith joins us live from Moscow. Stuart, peace talks began just over an hour ago at the Belarusian border. Any word on progress?
No, there isn't, and I don't think there will be for a while. Unconfirmed reports this could go as late as 11 p.m. local time, which would be in around 8 hours' time. This is the first time that Russia and Ukraine have met since the invasion began, and the likelihood of an outcome this evening is very, very low. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy said he does not really believe there will be an outcome to this meeting, but it's worth giving it a try. But consider this is only the start of formal talks, and in terms of the level of the delegation which Ukraine has sent, its highest ranking member in terms of the cabinet is the defense minister. So it's not the foreign minister and not yet the president, which would of course need to give their approval to any outcomes of the negotiation. So the defense minister of Ukraine, joined by one lawmaker from the Ukrainian parliament, also deputy foreign minister in attendance, and some administrative representatives from the president's office. They're there to try to come to a conclusion. As you said earlier, Ukraine looking for, at first, a ceasefire and then a withdrawal of Russian troops. Russia's been a lot less clear about its demands. The Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov says that we will wait and see how negotiations go before commenting on what Russia wants. But we know from previous statements by the president and the Kremlin, Russia's likely to want to see Crimea recognized as Russian by Ukraine, the separatist regions in eastern Ukraine declared fully autonomous, and also also all Western military equipment removed from Ukrainian territory. All of that, plus the key here, Ukraine withdraw its attempt to try to join the NATO military alliance. But there's one more potential spanner in the works for the Ukrainian government. President Putin of Russia has already been quite clear that he does not view the current Ukrainian government as legitimate. So it's not clear whether he would allow Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy to continue running Ukraine if there is progress in these talks.
Meanwhile, in Moscow, the Kremlin is still undeterred. It wants to ride out the latest barrage of Western sanctions. How long will it be able to do this? We saw the central bank today hiking interest rates. But is this sustainable?
Yes, it's a massive hike, and economists here are saying that cannot last long, such a major increase in the interest rate for any length of time. It will help to stem the damage in the short term, but it cannot be a long-term solution to Russia's problems. We know Russia is well adept at maintaining some kind of normalcy in terms of its economic situation in the face of sanctions. That's the refrain we get from the Kremlin any time new sanctions from the West are promised, especially since 2014. It's been no stranger to sanctions, but these are the hardest that have ever hit Russia. There is concern amongst Russian people that the economy is crashing, and if it were, then the level of disorder that could come from that, with people potentially protesting, could be one reason that makes the Kremlin think twice. So far, we've seen protests each night since the war began, although relatively small scale and unlikely to pose any substantial threat to what the government is doing for sure. Around 5,000 people detained over the last few nights of protest. But if the economic situation is to worsen considerably, which is likely with high inflation, food prices will rise, imports will become incredibly expensive to buy, well, then it's likely that things will need to change. The question is how. Potentially, Russia still has good relations with China, and that trade through China and economic support that way could be one option. The status of China-Russia ties is at a record high, but without access to Western capital, with the US dollar very difficult to make use of, it's a very new situation for Russia, and frankly, going forwards, we just don't know.
Oh, thanks for that, Stuart Smith in Moscow.
Rosie Bircher joins us live from Brussels. Rosie, more than 400,000 Ukrainians, they've fled their country. It's the middle of winter now. They've gone to Poland, Hungary and beyond. What protection can the EU offer them now?
You're quite right. We heard from the UN Human Rights Commissioner Michelle Bachelet this morning that more than 400,000 people were now understood to be displaced and having left Ukraine. The European Union has 4 countries which border Ukraine, including Poland and Hungary. And I think that first line of support really has been the people of Poland and Hungary, who have been pouring towards these borders in their droves to offer support in a human form. So offering rides back to other cities, offering food, offering material for children, for example. But the bigger question really is what the EU can offer in terms of refugee status for these Ukrainians. So we know that Ukrainians have visa-free access to the European Union. That lasts for 90 days. But we did hear from the European Union's Home Affairs Commissioner Ylva Johansson that we need to think about day 91. And in fact, Ylva Johansson is currently at that Ukrainian border with Romania to speak about this specifically. We do know that the European Union's executive, that's the European Commission, is considering trying to relax some visa rules moving forward. That will be discussed later this week at a meeting of Home Affairs ministers. What will be tricky there is the question of whether that kind of relaxation of visa rules might spill into different policy in the future. We know that some of these countries which are now sort of, throwing their borders open to Ukrainian refugees have not been so open to other refugees in the past, and they've actually been criticised on some occasions by the European Union's top court for failing to take in what the EU believes was its fair share of Syrian refugees, for example. So big questions, but of course right now it's this acute humanitarian crisis, and the European Union has also been ramping up funds available in order to better meet this crisis. And there are several countries, I think more than 20 countries now, have offered at least some sort of support either to those borders or to Ukraine directly when it comes to that kind of acute humanitarian crisis.
And meantime, Rosie, there is now this coordinated European response to deliver arms to Ukraine. Do we know, though, how those weapons are going to be sent to the front line?
That is the question of the moment. EU defence ministers are in talks virtually as we speak on this precise topic. We had this announcement yesterday from the European Union's top officials and the bloc's top diplomat that there would be around €500 million being set aside to provide Ukraine, particularly with lethal weapons. And it's hard to just really to overstate just how much of a watershed moment that might be perceived as in European defence policy. That certainly is a major turning point. We haven't seen anything of this scale before, neither in terms of the scale of the financing nor in that specific note that these are lethal weapons. However, we do know that some questions might be raised on how they will be delivered. We heard from the European Union's top diplomat that Poland, that shares that border with Ukraine, has offered to serve as a hub for transporting weapons. But of course, with Russian troops across that border, those are questions that still need to be raised, and we will be hearing more from the bloc's top diplomat in the next couple of hours on exactly how they plan to do that.
All right, Rosie, thank you for that update. Rosie Burchard there in Brussels.